We humans, we spend like all this time thinking and feeling, experiencing this thing we call consciousness, right? But have you ever actually stopped to think about how something as wild as consciousness even, like, showed up in the first place?
It's a question that's puzzled people for, well, probably as long as we've been conscious.
And today we're diving into Antonio Damasio's Feeling and Knowing to, explore his take on it all.
What I find fascinating about Damasio's approach is that he doesn't just try to tell us what consciousness is, he digs into the how and the why, and get this, he starts by taking us way, way back to life before consciousness, before consciousness as we typically think about it.
Life before consciousness. Okay, now you've got me intrigued, but I got to be honest, my brain needs a little help here. What does that even like? What does that even look like? Life without consciousness.
Okay, so picture this. Single-celled organisms just going about their business for billions of years. No existential crisis, no philosophy seminars to survive,
Just vibing.
basically. And Damasio, he breaks down life's evolution into these three stages: being, feeling, knowing. And that first stage, being, that lasted for a long, long time.
So hold on, are you saying that even those like OG life forms, bacteria and such, they had some kind of intelligence?
Absolutely, they had to survive. Damasio gives this really cool example of something called quorum sensing in
Oh,
bacteria.
that's sensing.
Yeah, so these bacteria, they can actually sense how many other bacteria are around them, and then get this, they can actually change their behavior depending on like how many other bacteria are around.
Well, it's like they've got their own little social network, like a chemical internet or something.
Exactly. Now, obviously, it's not the same kind of intelligence we use to write novels or compose symphonies, but it worked.
Okay, that's wild.
Yeah.
But how does bacterial intelligence connect to our consciousness?
Yeah.
The kind that, like, we experience as humans.
So that's the million-dollar question, right? And here's the connection. That bacterial intelligence, as strange as it might seem to us, it existed for billions of years before we came on the scene. Which just goes to show you that our human intelligence, the kind we often see as like the gold standard, well, it's not the only game in town.
Right, it's like thinking about intelligence in totally different terms.
Exactly. And for most of life's history on Earth, consciousness as we know it, it wasn't even a requirement.
It's kind of humbling when you put it like that.
Totally. And Damasio argues that to really understand our type of consciousness, we need to explore how our brains kind of like build upon that ancient foundation of being to create something completely new.
So, okay, if even bacteria, single-celled organisms, they have their own way of being intelligent, what makes human consciousness, like, so special? What sets us apart?
That's the key question, right? And Damasio, he points to this amazing ability our brains have, this ability to create and use what he calls images.
Images, like, are we talking about actual pictures in our minds?
That
Visuals?
Well, not exactly. Damasio, he uses this word images kind of broadly.
Yeah.
He's really talking about any kind of mental pattern that represents something our senses pick up. Could be a sound you hear, a smell, a feeling in your stomach, anything. Basically anything that gets translated into this pattern in your brain. And these patterns, they become like the building blocks of your mind, right? The raw material for thinking.
Okay, so it's like even a stomachache can be a mental image in a way.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where things get really interesting. Damasio, he highlights something called interoception, and this is our ability to actually sense what's going on inside our bodies.
So, like, being aware of our heartbeat, our breathing, even just knowing your stomach is grumbling, that's all part of this interoception.
Yeah, all of that. It's like your body has this whole internal sensory system that's constantly sending, updates to the brain.
So that means being aware of those internal sensations, that's actually like a key part of what makes consciousness possible.
It's a huge piece of the puzzle because these internal sensations, they're actually the foundation of feelings. And for Damasio, feelings, well, they're the bridge between like our physical selves and our conscious minds.
Hold on. Feelings are the key to consciousness.
Yeah.
That's like not how we usually think about feelings. At least I don't.
I know, right? It's a pretty wild idea. We tend to think of feelings as just like these fleeting emotions, totally subjective.
Yeah, totally.
But Damasio, he's arguing that feelings are way more fundamental than that.
So how do they actually, connect to this whole idea of consciousness then?
Well, think about it this way. Your feelings, they actually provide this kind of constant status report on what's happening inside your body.
Right.
So your heart rate, your blood pressure, digestion, all of it, it gets translated into these feelings.
Interesting.
And this constant stream of information coming from the inside, it's essentially how your brain knows, like, you're you, a distinct being separate from everything else.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's like my body is always talking to me, even if I'm not, consciously paying attention to every little thing.
Exactly. And here's the really crucial part. All those feelings, they actually create this sense of ownership. You feel those sensations. And it's like, okay, this is happening to me in my body.
Right, like it draws the line between what's me and what's not me.
You got it. And that me, that sense of like a subjective experience, that's at the very heart of what it means to be conscious, to know that we know.
Wow. Okay, so to kind of bring this all together, it's not enough to just have a brain processing all this data. We have to actually feel it too, connect it to ourselves, to our body.
Exactly. Damasio uses this, well, it's kind of a painful example to illustrate this. He talks about like having a kidney stone, what they call a renal colic.
Oh, ouch. Yeah, I can only imagine.
Right. He describes it as this like super intense physical sensation, but then that pain, it gets translated into a mental image in the brain.
You become aware of it.
Exactly. It enters your consciousness. And then because you're aware of it, well, that triggers a whole cascade of other responses. You might start sweating, feeling nauseous, doing whatever you can to make that pain stop. It's like this crazy, intense loop between your body and mind.
So the feeling, the pain in this case, it creates this powerful bridge between the actual physical experience of the pain and your awareness of it.
Exactly. And that bridge, that interaction, that's what makes it so important to
It's
consciousness.
not just about having a body or having a mind. It's about how those two things work together.
You got it. It's about how the body and mind are always interacting, informing each other, and ultimately, like, creating that feeling of subjective experience we call consciousness.
That is a really fascinating way to look at it. So where does the actual brain fit into all of this? Like how does this whole interaction between the body and mind actually work in the brain? So we've got this like incredible link, right? This link between feelings and the body and ultimately consciousness. But how does it actually, how does it work in our brains? Does Damasio ever actually say where consciousness is in the brain?
That's where Damasio really challenges the usual way of thinking about consciousness. He says basically that we've been looking at it the wrong way for all these years. Like we're too focused on what's called the hard problem of consciousness.
Okay, so for those of us who haven't, dedicated our life to thinking about this stuff, what is the hard problem? And why does Damasio, why does he take issue with it?
So the hard problem is basically this question, right? It asks, how does a physical thing like a brain, how does that create the experience of consciousness? And it tends to focus like almost completely on the brain, especially the cortex, the outer layer.
Oh, right, the part we always see in those brain images, all wrinkly.
Yeah, exactly. And that part is, super important for thinking and, all that. But Damasio's argument is that by just focusing on the brain, we miss this crucial interplay between our actual physical experiences, the feelings we've been talking about, and our mental state.
So it's not just about the brain, thinking on its own. It's also about how the brain is constantly getting all this information from the body.
Exactly. And Damasio, he points to this part of the brain called the brainstem. And the brainstem is really, really old, evolutionarily speaking. We share it with, even simple organisms.
Right, the brainstem. So that's the part that keeps, our heart beating and, all those really basic functions we need to, not die immediately.
Exactly. But it's also doing way more than just keeping the lights on. I mean, think about it. That's the main connection between your body and the rest of your brain, like the cortex, the thinking part. So the brainstem, that's like the hub. That's where all those feelings and sensations from your body, they get, translated into the language of the brain.
Oh, wow. Okay, so it's less of a solo and more like the conductor of a whole orchestra.
Exactly. And Damasio uses this example. It's kind of a sad one, but he talks about locked-in syndrome.
Locked-in syndrome.
Yeah, so this is where, tragically, someone is totally conscious, they're aware, they're thinking and feeling, but they can't move or communicate because the connection between their brain and their muscles is damaged.
Wow, that's awful. But I see where you're going with this, because their brains are still creating that conscious experience, even though they can't physically interact with the world.
Right, exactly. And this example just shows us that consciousness isn't this like abstract thing that exists separately from our bodies. It's totally intertwined with our physical selves.
Yeah, okay, so this has all been super fascinating. But I have to ask, from, an evolutionary standpoint, why does all this matter so much? If consciousness is so reliant on this deep connection between mind and body, what kind of advantage did that give our, early ancestors? Why did consciousness evolve?
Well, Damasio, he argues that consciousness, with its roots in feeling, it actually gave our ancestors some pretty big survival advantages.
Okay, like what?
Well, for one, it meant our ancestors weren't just, reacting to their environment in this totally automatic way. They could start to actually prioritize their own needs, make decisions based on like how they felt rather than just, instinct.
Interesting.
Yeah, so, think about early humans. They could use their conscious awareness to be like, okay, I'm hungry, I need to find food. Or I'm
Hmm.
cold, I need to find shelter. It's all driven by feelings.
Right. So it's less about just like responding to the world around them and more about making choices based on what's going on internally.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And this ability to, prioritize needs, well, it played a huge role in shaping like social structures. Our ancestors, they could cooperate, share resources, and it was all based on this shared understanding of like needs and feelings.
That makes sense. It's way easier to like build a community when you can actually understand and relate to what's going on inside other people's heads
Right.
or their bodies, I guess.
Exactly. And we can't forget about the really like the human aspects of consciousness, right? The creativity, the problem solving, all that stuff. Damasio, he believes that all comes from consciousness too. We imagine things, we invent things, we plan for the future, and it's all because we actually care about what happens.
So we're not just reacting to the world, we're actively shaping it with our minds.
Right. It's all driven by our internal experience, by our feelings, and that's a pretty powerful idea. And that actually leads us to one last mind-blowing question that Damasio asks. He asks, if we can actually understand how feelings create consciousness, could we build machines that actually feel too?
Machines that feel. That's a whole other, like, that's wild. That's not just, robots following algorithms. It's like robots with, like, inner lives.
Right. It's a question with huge implications. If we could create machines that experience the world through feelings, would we treat them differently? What would it mean to be a machine like that?
It's certainly a lot to think about.
Yeah.
And that's all the time we have for today.
This whole conversation diving into Damasio's work has been, it's been eye-opening for me. It's really made me appreciate, how incredible this thing we call consciousness really is. It's this amazing product of billions of years of evolution. And, it's deeply connected to who we are as physical beings.
Well said. It's definitely given all of us a lot to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the fascinating world of feeling and knowing.